and welcome back to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we're going to cover the Microsoft Network Operating System. Let's get started. So looking at our roadmap, you can see that we're about halfway through our operating system section. We're going to cover Microsoft's networking operating system today. Linux we'll cover in the next chapter, and then the following chapter will cover servers. So those are going to be our four lectures on operating systems. Depending on how old you are, you may not remember when Microsoft started their network operating systems. Somewhere around 1993, they first started their Windows for Workgroups peer-to-peer operating system and their Windows NT 3.1. So 1993 is about when Windows NT started. In that time, they have obviously advanced. We went through Windows 2000, so from 1993 to 2000, then we did 2003, 2008, roughly every 4 to 5 years, 2012, 2016. We have actually moved on from 2016 on to 2019 last year. However, this textbook was written before that, so it doesn't know anything about 2019. So we're just going to assume, for the purposes of this lecture, that 2016 was the last version. We began to call the name for grouping together computers work groups. So if you have 3 or 4 computers and they're all connected together, we would put them in something called a work group. This is a group of people who work together. And in this place, we could share databases, share printers, share files, things like this. A domain is the group of users and equipment in the network. So you can have multiple work groups in a single domain. But a domain is going to be anything in the whole client-server network, whereas the work group is just the group of computers that share the resources. You could separate that into the administrative suite or HR or IT. They could have their own work group where they share their own resources, but the entire domain could incorporate all of those. All of the Microsoft operating system versions are going to support a couple of different things. They'll support IPv6, so version 6 of IP, remote desktop, Active Directory, IIS, .NET, and encrypting file systems, so EFS. These are all basic supported services that are provided by Microsoft's operating systems. Generally, you could figure out which operating system you have if you remember which client OS was about the same time. Right now, 2016, 2019 look a lot like Windows 10. If you go back, Windows Server might look a little bit more like Windows 7. Windows Server 2008 to 2012, they might be more like Windows 7. You might get back to something that looks similar to XP or Vista, one of the older ones, as you keep going back. So generally, you could figure that the Microsoft operating system is going to be somewhat similar to whichever operating system was going on. They all kind of use the same look and feel. Now, even though at the moment most of these operating systems could still be in use, some of them have already hit their end of life. Best way to find this out is to go online and find out if your operating system has hit end of life. Just because it's end of life does not mean it's dead, doesn't mean it's not useful. It could still work. It just means that there's no more patches or updates that are going to help protect it from security issues. So when they find new viruses and they find new malware, they're not going to update older versions and versions that are no longer supported because they've hit their end of life. The basic rule of thumb, you never want to be more than 2 server versions behind. As we're at 2019, that would say if you are below 2012, you are probably too old and you've got to upgrade because you're no longer going to be getting those security patches that you need to keep things up to date and protected. So as I said, for the purposes of this book, we're going to assume 2016 is the version that we're using. Couple of things with 2016 server. There are 3 optional editions. There's actually a couple of more, but there's the 3 basic ones. Standard is your basic version. That's going to be the kind of standard version. It's not updated or upgraded for specific situations. It's just standard. Then we have created a data center. This is designed for virtualized environments, places where you're going to remote log in and create a virtual environment. And then we have our essentials, which is intentionally created for cloud-based services. So if you were to go onto Microsoft's Azure, you could create a Windows server using the essentials Server Edition. There's a couple of different features that you're going to find in Windows Server 2016. The little graph here over on the right-hand side can show you what is available in each of those different versions. So you can see that the Data Center version actually has the most functionality, whereas the Enterprise may have some functionality that the Data Center or that the Standard doesn't have, and vice versa. So you can kind of look through that and figure out which version you're going to want. Understanding what each of those features does is kind of important. So starting with cache or branch cache, this actually started with Windows Server 2008, somewhere around Windows 7, and it allowed you to download internet content so that it could be cached in case you wanted to reference it again. It just improved in performance, being able to use this cache. Around 2008 as well, we started the direct access. So before that, if you wanted to log into a server, you would have to remote in through a VPN. Starting with Windows 2008 server, we now can connect directly. So you log in once, authenticate, and then it'll connect you and you can keep that connection open. You only have to do it once. So direct access into the server rather than having to connect via VPN. A failover cluster or a server cluster is designed where servers are connected physically and logically in a constant service so that everything's connected. Even if they're not right next to each other, they allowed the different servers to be connected. And this was going to allow you to do some failovers. So if there was a problem with one of your servers, the other server could pick it up. So we called it a failover cluster or a server cluster of these servers put together. The Hyper-V terminal is actually a Microsoft Server virtualization. You can do this virtualization and create virtual servers on your server. The great thing about this is you can actually run multiple operating systems from the same active device. So if I wanted to have a Linux machine on my Windows server, I can use Hyper-V to do that. So Hyper-V was one of the great things that we added to Windows Server. IIS is your basic web service hosting. So if you are running a web server, you can use your IIS, comes with Windows Server automatically, and allows you to do web hosting from your computer. NAP is Network Access Protection. By the way, I'm pretty sure this acronym comes up later, so you've got to remember by context what the acronym refers to. But in this case, the Network Access Protection is an added little feature that Server added. So it will look at the health of the OS before a connection is made. Made sure that they have the best malware, the updated versions, any patches, things like this before you go online. This is intentional in case there's any malware out there that they have the latest and greatest virus protections available every time that it connects to the outside network. Remote access, you may have already done at some point. It's being able to log into the server using a remote access option. One of those is called Radius, and we will talk about that in a further chapter. You can also use a VPN to log in. Of course, it requires authentication. You have to give it a username and password, but this is one of the ways that you can get into server from another location. And the last one is what we call either Server Core or the Nano Server. And this is a minimized server configuration. It allows you to do everything that you need to do without all the fluff. There's no GUI, there's no interface for you to type in, and you usually can only log in because of a remote desktop, like you can remote into it. They're designed this way to actually prevent security failures of people taking advantage of the GUI or people doing things with the GUI that they shouldn't be doing. It just uses a command prompt and allows you to do everything that you need to do virtually without actively creating something on the server that could make it open for security breaches. So it's a little less vulnerable than the standing version of Microsoft Server because it doesn't have the GUI and you don't have to deal with that. So these are the different things that occur inside of your Windows Server 2016. 2019, I bet it's going to use all of these and a couple more. So we're going to have a couple of slides that just describe some administrative components that exist in Windows Server. First off, we have the ability to break down domain, workgroup, and home group membership. Now, Most people really struggle with those three. Are they all exactly the same thing? What's the domain versus the work group versus the home group? Remember, we introduced home group with Windows 7. What's the difference between a work group and a home group? So this is where the description here of those three comes in. A work group must be a member of either a work group or a domain, whereas a home group is an optional choice. The peer-to-peer versus client-server, you can do a peer-to-peer with a work group and a home group, but a domain is going to be client-server. Each computer has their own set of user accounts versus them being stored in a central location, a central database. Optional versus required passwords. So if we go through the list here, you'll find that there's a lot of differences between them, and you really want to make sure that when you're designing your server, that you understand when you say, I want it to be a domain server, I want it to be a work group, I want it to be a home group, and what the restrictions are going to be in that situation. Obviously, we have the ability to create group accounts. So groups are groups of users that generally have a similar function or goal. They do kind of the same thing. Either they're all in HR, they're all in admin, they're all in IT. They all are department chairs in different departments, but they all have a similar function. They're in a specific location of the building, and they share the same printers or the same data files. You can break down group accounts by administrative, which gives you large amounts of power, guest accounts, which removes most of your power. You can usually read but not do anything else. The ability to remote access in. If you're a remote access user, you could be part of that group. You could be an operator in a specific industry or in a specific part of your network that would allow you access to different parts of your resources. So your group accounts are really useful to be able to break people into which group do you belong in, whose resources are you using, who needs to share your resources, and to keep you all straight. Obviously, we have individual user accounts. So this is a personal login right. When you have a username and password, just like you do in any school environment, you're going to log in with your username and password, and it's going to be personal to you. You don't share this with anyone else. You are given specific permissions, and you can be assigned to specific groups. Your permissions could be read and write, they could be execute, they could be save, they could be different types of things, create options there. So user accounts are going to give you specific types of permissions. When we look at our security policy, we have multiple policies that we can reference. Our local versus our global policies. We can do auditing, we can check error logs. And the example given here shows a couple of the different security settings. I can click on any of those options, account policies, local policies, so on and so forth, and find more information about specific users. This could give me the ability to reset someone's password or limit their access to a resource. A couple more administrative components. We have the ability to share network resources, so allowing and denying your ability to access a resource, whether it's a network share, a specific drive, if you have the ability to read, write, or execute on that drive. So I can share a drive of mine that might keep some information that other people might want to use, but I can limit them to reading only. Like they can't modify any of my files, they can just read only. Or maybe they can modify them, but they can't create new files and they can't delete. So you can give different permission controls. When you do your file sharing, you're using the server message block, or SMB, as we talked about in the previous chapter. That protocol is used for file sharing from within the Windows OS. The Microsoft came up with the concept of the Common Internet File System, or the CIFS, because they were trying to come up with a way that everybody would use the same thing. Didn't really work that way, and it did not become the common interface or the Common Internet File System because people just didn't do it. So in some cases it was useful, but it is definitely not common, and there are a lot of people that don't use it. It was kind of their way of saying, here's a great way of doing this. Let's all follow in line. And everybody said, yeah, we don't really feel like it. So that was the Common Interface or Internet File System, CIFS, which was their version of file sharing. In the end, they went back to SMB, and then they can communicate with SMB either with Apple or with Linux, using Samba with Linux, or SMB back with Apple, and everybody just kind of got used to it. Obviously, with administrative, you can set up your disk management. So the file here, or the image here of setting up your disk management is going to allow you to partition your disk. You can take your disk, your terabyte, your 5 terabyte disk, and break it up into multiple segments or partitions to be able to allocate 500 gigabytes here, a terabyte there, 250 gigabytes here, and break it up into different partitions. We created the new technology file system, or the NTFS file format, with Windows 3.1. Before that, we used to use the FAT, or the FAT file allocation table, to do the same thing. What this does, the NTFS, is it actually sets those disk quotas for each disk. It gives you a limitation of how much data you can put on that disk. If you have a computer that you got pre-made from HP or something like that with a Windows machine, you can have the same thing where your computer created an NTFS and then broke it down probably into a systems directory where your C drive is that might be limited to maybe 100 gigabytes or 200 gigabytes, and then the rest of your data for a D drive, something like that. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about partitions and breaking out different parts of your computer. Obviously, Windows Administrative is going to allow you to do that kind of thing with your data. A couple more administrative components. As I said before, you can have user and group permissions. You can also have share permissions. And with your NTFS or your share, you can give full control, the ability to modify, read and execute, etc., to different users or different shares. So I can take my drive, my share, and I can say, I'm going to give anybody who has access to this full control to do whatever they want with this. Or more importantly, I'm going to limit it to read-only access. So you can do that to the device or the thing that's being shared, your drive or whatever it is, your printer or whatever it is you want to share. You can give different permission options. And the next one is just your basic admin tools. And we're going to talk a little bit more about MMC with your Microsoft Management Console in just a minute. This is your basic control panel for Windows Administrative on your Windows server. At this point, we're going to introduce Active Directory or Active Directory Domain Services, sometimes shortened to Active Directory, just AD, and sometimes ADDS. So Active Directory Domain Services is the Windows standard for management of your users and your devices. It uses LDAP, which is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and HTTP to be able to communicate and use those for interface options. When we talk about our Active Directory, you need to think about how the directory is built. Generally, we have an overreaching domain. That domain can sometimes be called a forest. Inside of the forest are trees. So trees are technically collections of domains that have a common root. So a bunch of trees all have the same root, and they exist in a forest. The forest is a collection of trees that share a common Active Directory database. So all of the Active Directory trees that exist in a single domain, or all the different domains that exist together, are called a forest. So the forest is using the same database. Inside of that, each of the different trees can be their own collection of domains. And they have to have the common root. So they can be in what we call a contiguous namespace. Each of the individual items underneath this can be contained in an organizational unit. So we can limit things to specific units. In the example here with the forest at the top, we have the sales unit. And then inside the organizational unit, we can have individual users inside there. So our sales.chicago.xyz corp is the sales organizational unit inside the chicago.xyz corp.com domain. Okay. You can have what we call a disjointed namespace, non-contiguous, which is where a secondary root domain exists in the same forest. Remember, forest means they share the same Active Directory database. So you can create a forest that has two separate root domains. Does that make sense? Okay. The examples down here give you different domains, A, B, and C, or a singular domain that has multiple computers and multiple servers in multiple locations. Domains don't have to be in the same location. They simply mean, from a logical point of view, that you are grouping things together. So you can have your New York XYZ Corp, or you could just have your in its own domain, or it could be in the same domain as the Orlando or the San Francisco version. Each one of those domains can go down to have different users at different points. So let's continue with Active Directory on the next slide. With our Active Directory, we refer to things called common name. This is the user supplied name. If it was your user that we were referencing, or administrator supplied, if it was your user, we might call you C. Simpson, or John Doe, something like that might be your administrator supplied name. We also have what we call a distinguished name. A distinguished name uniquely identifies the location inside of that structure. So you noticed on the previous slide that we'd structured our Active Directory so that everybody could figure out where they were, whether you were down Chicago sales and inside of there, which means your distinguished name is going to be your common name in association with your domain component, which is the full domain URL. It also will include your organizational unit. So what group does it exist in? So if I was to put C. Simpson as a user, as an object inside of my my Active Directory, I would have C. Simpson with a organizational unit of sales with a domain component of chicagoxyzcorp.com. So they'll all go together. When you log into Active Directory, obviously it's going to be an interactive login. You're going to put in your user and you're going to get access to the Active Directory. Once you've logged in, Active Directory's network authentication is going to verify that you have permission to do things. So it's a two-stage authentication that Active Directory uses. You log in. Once your name and password have been checked to make sure that those are correct, now we go look at Active Directory's authentication to figure out what permissions do you actually have. And then we move on from there. Once we find out what your permissions are, we can then log you in, get you access to your resources. Active Directory uses a concept of trust relationships between multiple trees, multiple forests, and multiple domains. So a trust relationship, in a general term, is just your relationship between multiple domains. You can have either two-way trust, where everybody trusts everybody else. Company A, Company B, they share resources, everybody shares with everybody else, and we're happy. So both directions share. They are both trusted and trusting domains. That's a two-way trust. A one-way trust has a trusted domain and a trusting domain. The trusted domain has access to the resources in the trusting domain, but not the other way around. This is kind of like parents can talk to can do things to their children, but the children can't take out of their bank accounts, something like that. So one-way trust domain, or one-way trust relationship, is where it's only one direction. We can also have a complex trust, where we have three or more domains that all have full trust with each other. In the situation at the college, we might have a full trust relationship between Great Falls and Bozeman and Northern, and all three of them may talk to each other and have a relationship between the three of them. It doesn't have to just be between two domains. It could be between three domains, and that's fine. You also cannot always be sure that just because I trust you and you trust a third party, that I'm going to trust the third party. We call that transitive, and that's not always guaranteed. It's an option, and you could say it, but it's not a guarantee. Underneath our complex trust with three or more domains, we have the ability of a forest trust. This is where it's a two-way trust relationship between two forests. Remember, a forest is a collection of domains that exist on the same Active Directory server, the same Active Directory database. So you can have a relationship between two different Active Directory relationships, and that's an option. You can also have an external trust. This is a trust relationship with different versions of Windows OS, or if other domains are in separate forests. So we have our forest here, and there's another domain in another forest over there, externally to our entire network. We can have a relationship like that. We just call it an external trust. And the last version of our trust is a realm trust. So if If you think about, medieval times, we have our forests, and then outside of our forests, we have our kingdom. Then we go to the whole realm. Trust relationships are between Windows and non-Windows domains. So if you have a Unix machine, you have an Apple machine, you have a Mac OS, and you want to interact between those would be realm trusts, offering a trust between a Windows AD system and a non-Windows AD system. And you can have those as well. All right, so coming back to the administrative section, we just touched on the Microsoft Management Console. So now we're going to give you a little bit more description on that. The Management Console is technically a GUI that was created with Windows 2000 and most Windows operating systems after that. Technically, MMC, or the Microsoft Management Console, isn't actually an item of itself. It's a container where you can snap in or add utilities and tools that you want to use from a management point of view. The example given down here shows you the snap-in ability where you can pick, what do you want to manage? What pieces of information do you want? Do you want IIS? Do you not want IIS? Let's go ahead and add it if you want it. Do you want your Hyper-V in there? Cool, let's add that. And we can snap in any of these different utilities or tools that we want into our Microsoft Management Console. You can manage your users, your groups, and your disk management at this point. So different utilities that we might have might include your security policies or your disk management, and they're described over to the side. When we talk about management of our disks, we talked a little bit about partitions, being able to break up disk management into partitions or volumes and specific lengths. The basic partition that you're going to use generally has a primary and then an extended partition. So this is your C drive and then the rest of your drive. So D, E, F if you choose to add a couple of extra drives. We also have the option of a dynamic disk option here as opposed to the basic. And the dynamic allows the system to change around its drives and use them differently. There are a couple of different types of drives, and we get into this more when we talk about RAID systems and different types of actual drives. But at this point, we can have simple drives, so a regular primary drive. We can have spanned drives, where we can have two physical drives that are combined. We can use them both. So I actually have a physical hard drive here and another physical hard drive in a different location, but they go together, and data is shared between two physical drives. We can have striped drives or striped volumes, which allows you to spread your data across multiple drives. So it's striped. A little bit of data is on this drive, a little bit's on drive B, a little bit's on drive C, to be able to spread your data across. We can have mirrored or RAID drives, which allow you to do fault tolerance so that you copy the entire drive to a different location in case one of the drives fails. So we talk about more of this when we get into the drives. If this is kind of confusing, that's okay. I just want to kind of introduce you to those words. So the striped, the spanned, the mirrored, and the RAID drives. We're going to talk about those a little further. But those are the different disk management options that you have inside of your MMC, inside your Windows administration. At the end of the chapter, we just touch on the Posix and interoperability. There we go. Posix is the portable operating system interface that was designed by IEE. Told you that name would come up a lot. The original version actually was Portable Operating System Interface for Unix, which is where the X comes in Posix. So it was designed for Unix, but essentially it covers the file name structure, access, and any of the rules that go along with file sharing. It was designed to allow compatibility between Microsoft and Unix, and it's still used for that purpose today. So the Portable Operating System Interface, Posix, is designed to allow compatibility if you're switching from one operating system to another, specifically Unix to Microsoft and back and forth. Make sure that your naming structures and everything are going to be fine. Back in the olden days, when they first started naming, some operating systems would allow 10 characters and some would allow 20. Well, if you take the file from the 20 and push it over to the 10, you just lost half of your data, half of your file name. So being able to have this operating system interface option between the two helped a lot to control interactions between different operating systems. And interoperability. So originally, as we talked about, everybody had their own protocols and everybody was proprietary and they all did the kind of their own thing. It used to be hard. It used to be hard to interact between a Microsoft and a Mac OS and a Linux machine. You either used a Linux or you used a Microsoft or you used a Mac OS, but you never tried to do all three in the same setting. Because everybody switched back over to TCP/IP, it made it much easier to integrate between them, and now interoperability is not as much of a problem. So let's talk about your assignments. Obviously, review questions, always optional. You're welcome to do them. Study guide, there's a lot in here. There was a lot of little pieces of information. They may not all be the most important piece of information, but there was a lot of them. And I want you to make sure you understand how the Windows Server operating system works. So the network operating system for Microsoft works. The lab activities for Chapter 7 are all related to installing and administering a Windows 2016 device. You probably don't have one. I don't have one. That's okay. They are all designed for the 2016 server. Adding users, groups, files, print service, fun things like these. These labs are actually really useful, but kind of hard to do if you don't have a virtual server or if you don't have a way to get into one. Couple of options. If you have an extra computer hanging around, there is a trial version of 2016 server that you can download and use for 180 days for free. If you feel like installing and running a 2016 server on that extra machine you have hanging out in the corner, go for it. That's a great way to do this because you will get some real hands-on experience. You can set up a virtual machine either in Azure or in some sort of cloud computing situation. It'll cost you a couple of dollars. If you use it, do the labs, and then shut it back down. Shouldn't be too expensive, but that's an option as well. The third is being able to use NetLab. I am working on it. As of the time that I am doing this video, I do not know if we're going to get it to work, so do not count on this. If we can, I will definitely be sending you a post that says you can come to the lab or you can log into the NetLab to do these labs. If we get that available for you, the labs will probably switch from optional to required. So don't quote me on the optional required. Make sure you check D2L, verify that these are the assignments that are given. Again, just like any lab, there's like 8 of them that are different things that you're doing with Windows 2016. And just getting that experience is great for you. So if you have the opportunity, if you have a place at work that you could do this, if you could just go glance at the server at work, that would be a great thing as well. Again, the StudyMate Chapter 7 study help is available, and don't forget to take the quiz. I hope you learned a lot about the Microsoft operating system with this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free, leave them in the chat or let me know, leave them in the comments. And please come back next time and we will cover the Unix operating system. Have a great week.